Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Free TFOS, where I take old stories that I've done and update them to modern audio standards. This particular story is called Forsaken Love, written by RegalLegalEagle. Such a painful thing it is, love. So often in the past, I would find myself bemused by the description of this feeling by friends and comrades, both that they could find it in the age of war, and that it seemed to fall upon them at any moment without understanding. So often the flower of friendship would blossom into something greater as each side tended to the roots. I never would have expected such a sensation in myself. Not then, and not now, despite the fact that I truly understand it firsthand. I would watch her every day as she wandered into the valley from my vantage looking over it. I still vividly recall the first day she came into view. I assumed, like so many others who dared enter the Valley of Bones, that she was either lost or a scavenger. If she were the latter, I would scare her off like the others, and if she were lost, I would do what I could to gently guide her back to safety. But to my surprise, she didn't seem to fall to either category. Instead, she had wandered between the bones, ignoring them, as she instead focused on the patches of wildflowers that grew here. For the rest of the day, I idly watched her from my perch, both amused and curious at her behavior. When she finally left around dusk to head back over the hill and out of the valley, I assumed that would be the last I saw of her. But a week later, she returned at dawn, and carrying tools, she spent the day working the patches of wildflowers while I watched from a distance, shaping and forming them from simple patches into actual gardens. It was amazing to watch someone make something within a valley which was so long known only for bones and dead that I wrought. Was she not afraid of me like the others? Was she not curious about my perch like the scavengers? I had so many questions that I dare not ask for fear of truly driving her away. So I simply watched from a distance. How strange it might be that I could feel love building within me as I watched her every day without speaking to her. Was communication not the cornerstone of love, if not the very foundation upon which any relationship should be built? But I felt like I knew her so well, simply through observation every day. The determination with which she worked, the skill with which she turned the untamed wild into carefully cultivated gardens and fields, even the way she'd laugh over little mistakes and accidents while she worked. How close I felt to her, watching over as the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks stretched into months, and even beyond. She had built a small house at the edge of the valley, since she spent so much time here tending to her gardens, and even had some sort of animal to pull some small wagon to and from the village in the distance. I was so curious about what they did in the distance. Their homes built just at the edge of my vision of my perch. I had noticed that they had grown, but didn't know much else. Long ago, I had learned not to try and move closer, as they would always flee in terror upon my approach. But as I felt closer to all of them as I watched her, she would take the flowers and plants that she had grown into town and return with other goods, sacks of things, bags, even a few barrels and boxes. What did they think of her? Did they think of her so brave for daring to live here in my valley? Did they think her foolish, insane? I'd liked to think that she was as loved by them as she was by me, that they celebrated her skill, industry, and courage in her choosing to make her life gardening within the Valley of Bone. Yet I never saw her with another. It was simply her animal, and me watching over them as the days crept by. Maybe there was some tiny form of companionship between her and I that had made me feel so connected to her. But that desire to end my solitude also gave me such pain. I had seen how they all behaved in the past when I first woke from my near death and tried to stand beside them, like I had so often in the war. The terror and fear in their faces as clear upon my very awakening. As I called to my brothers and sisters, so that our song may once more fill the very skies, I was greeted with nothing but screams from the locals, and not a single note of my kin was returned to me. I was left alone, confused, and isolated in my valley of bones. I had settled in to do what I could from a distance, driven by my purpose, and yet shackled by it. So then that I risk all that to try and talk to her, to possibly connect with the one person who didn't seem to be as afraid of me as the others. If I was wrong, I could drive her away, and once she was past the hill, she'd be out of my sight, possibly for good. But how long would I wait by and only watch as I felt the deep pain of loneliness creep further and further through me? How long would it be until the pain of watching her from afar outweighed the fear of driving her away by finally making myself known to her? To try and feel out her response, I had tried to lure her deeper into the bones a few times, leaving out some of the most sought-after treasures from my valley for her to find. But she showed no interest in the items of metals and glass. For her, it was all about her gardens. So then, one night, I left her a small trinket, a necklace made of fine gold and a glass flower, unlike any she could find in the valley. She seemed hesitant and nervous at first, but accepted the gift after exploring the area I left it in and finding no other people nearby that it could belong to. I could watch her wear it now from a distance each day. It gave me much pride, but also increased my pain day by day. I felt nearly ready to make myself known to her. I wanted to wait until the second anniversary of her arrival. I was nervous, like I had never been before. Not even in the war had I felt such jittery anxiety creeping through me just at the thought of the meeting. Each night, I would dread terrible outcomes and try and envision ways to make it clear to her that I meant no harm and that I wanted to befriend her. I would save my confessions of love until later, so it didn't seem too intense too quickly. But such a hope for a carefully planned and meaningful first meeting was stolen from me 2 weeks before I intended. Warnings and alerts flared in my eyes as I caught sight of the enemy in the distance. At first, I hoped that I was mistaken, and it was much smaller than first thought, so I wouldn't need to respond with my full force. After all, it had been so very long since I had last seen a real enemy. Instead, I had simply picked apart their wicked little progeny and parasites that got close. Yet, when it crested the mountains in the distance of my perch, which had been specifically chosen to watch this very pass, it was emerging through, I knew that it wasn't so lucky. It was 120 meters tall, at least, but without any armor or gear grafted to its bulk that meant that it had to be feral. Some small comfort, then. I knew what this would mean, however, and I set aside my fears of terrifying my love. I looked out at her in her fields as I began to power up. As my generators began to spin up and my solar panels gleamed in the light, I knew that for a few minutes I would look as resplendent now as I did in the war. The glow of energy filling my core once more as my song of battle began to fill the air. She was surprised when I started to show signs of life. I could see it on her face, as I couldn't help but leave the zoomed-in image of her face up on my primary screen, while leaving the distant enemy on my periphery only. A feral wouldn't have any idea I was here, not from 15 kilometers away. It was feral and following instincts only. As I began to rumble and rise up to my full height, as my arms extended to secure themselves in the ground for firing stability, I had to send out my repair bots to quickly mend small issues I encountered. It had been far too long since I stretched, but I hadn't dared to since my love had arrived in the valley. It was mesmerizing to watch her face as I rose up and readied myself, to see her light up with surprise and joy. I wasn't sure exactly. It wasn't fear, though. It was something else. I could feel myself growing happy and excited along with her, to think that she wasn't terrified of me like the others. But I had to focus instead on the enemy in the distance once I saw him roar. He might have heard my song. Maybe he was smarter than I thought. I needed to end him now. I quickly plotted a firing solution as I watched him, my 50-meter cannon adjusting slightly as I settled into a fine position, and my arms dug into the ground. It had been so very long since I had fired my main gun, but I'd made sure the repair bots cleaned it every day in case something like this were to happen. It was strange to load up once more. I hadn't needed to fire my main gun since the last night of the war when I'd fallen asleep. But as long as it had been, it was still a familiar feeling as the elevator in my core lifted a 3-meter wide shell into place. This was where I finally had to speak to my love to warn her. I stopped the song of my generators for a moment so that I could speak, my voice booming out over the valley across my external speakers. Alert! Alert! Firing commencing shortly. All human personnel apply hearing protection immediately. She looked confused as I spoke. Did she even understand me? Did she even know my words? Cover your ears and ease, I tried next. Firing commencing in 5. She still looked confused. 4. Finally, she seemed to get it. 3. Her hands went to her ears and her mouth opened. 2. I had to hope what she was doing was enough. 1. With that, I fired, sending the 10-ton round at the monster in my view at 1,500 meters a second. My entire body shook and recoiled as I fired off the round. Such a familiar sensation, and yet oddly foreign at the same time, since it had been so long. The shockwave from the blast hit my love before the round hit the monster. The entire valley shuddered from the force of the explosion of me firing. The plants and flowers waving as the wave passed over them and sent her tumbling to the ground as I watched. In fact, all I could do in that moment was watch. Both her and my target in those long, terrible seconds that it took for my round to cross the distance and strike at my enemy. But my shot struck true as the enemy was hit in the center of the chest. There was a flash as the high-yield warhead exploded, rupturing my enemy and turning much of its torso and head into chunks that went flying apart as its 4 arms raised up to the sky for a moment in reflex before the remains of the body sagged and toppled over. Then I minimized the distant view and focused on the spot in the field where my love had fallen over. All I could do was watch with growing fear. When she rose up out of the plants, I felt intense relief that made me want to sigh if only I had lungs with which to do so. But then she was turning and running away from me. I felt a pang of guilt flooding through me as I watched her sprint back to her home, which I saw now had been cracked and partially broken from the shockwave. Her pack animal was kicking and braying at its enclosure, obviously terrified by the sound and force. I began to spin down my generators then and set my repair bots to clean my barrel once it was cool enough for them to enter safely. Once my love had reached her house, I saw her enter briefly and then emerge with some of her possessions. She set about freeing the frightened animal, which she soothed after a moment. Quickly harassing it to her wagon and throwing her possessions inside, she and the animal made for the hill and the edge of the valley. She was leaving me. The pain of being alone flared up quickly within me while I could do nothing but watch. What could I say to bring her back? How could I convince her what I had done was to protect her, to save her and her village? There was so much I wanted to say, to call out to my love. But instead, I quietly watched and set about settling down once more. I needed to prepare to fire again, just in case the feral wasn't alone. The day slowly turned to dusk. The blood-red glow of the setting sun bathed my valley in crimson light. Her house had cracked and partially collapsed an hour ago. I would see about sending some of my repair bots out to see if they could fix it. Or should I leave them by my side? I was filled with uncertainty and anxiety. The dark night gave way to day, which gave way to night once more. I watched the hill for days. I kept telling myself my love would return, that I could make things right. But it was possible that I couldn't, that I was destined to maintain my eternal vigil and only watch the village I protected in the very distance. Love was complicated and painful, especially for a war machine that had survived the apocalypse only to be forsaken by the very people who had created it. But it didn't matter, because I still loved them. Forsaken and alone though I may be, nothing would change my mind. I would stay here, and I would defend them as I always did. So I settled in once more, alone in my valley, my vision focused on the mountain pass before me. but I still would glance at the hill behind me. Maybe my love would not have to be forsaken forever. Even a war machine could dream. End of story. I'd quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Bushmaster 177, Henry the Red, Caspar Arnholtz, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Elijah Silvercross, Dragzoon WRE, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.